Hello, and thanks for tuning in. As always, this is Reverend JR, and I thought I'd take a quick minute to respond to another video from David Rives, telling us about how Mount St. Helens somehow proves the flood. Also, today, I am the setting sun, as you can see in this clear picture of my abundant glory. So now David is going to explain to us how sterile soil can grow plants, and that somehow is an argument for why plants could grow after the flood. I think anyone who has ever picked some plants out of their gutter knows that plants don't need actual soil to grow. Just throwing that out there.
I am standing at the beautiful Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument in Washington State. Now this area is gorgeous. It's filled with wildlife and abundant plant growth.
It's a pretty crazy coincidence that they put the park in a place that people find so beautiful and full of nature and stuff, isn't it? It's also really interesting to note how the plants are growing in temperate regions much better than they are in the national park, like you might find at the Grand Canyon, for example. I wonder why David didn't choose the Grand Canyon to show us how well plants grow on more or less sterile soil.
You know, it's kind of hard to imagine that just about 40 years ago, a massive volcanic eruption stripped the mountainside bare, killing all of the animals and completely destroying the forest.
I mean, yeah, that's a thing that happened. It's also interesting how quickly they grew back when you have, solid rainfall, and when your seeds haven't been underwater for a year, like when the flood happened, and all these other things. But never mind. David has the story for us. Also, just wanted to take a moment to point out this thing from the Mount St. Helens Science and Learning Center. That's mshslc.org. On a page about were any trees replanted after the eruption, in which it says probably the biggest single factor aiding the reestablishment of forest in areas around Mount St. Helens has been reforestation that has been conducted on timberlands around the volcano. The Forest Service salvaged 200 million board feet of blown down and standing dead timber from the 10,000 acres. To date, nearly 10 million trees have been planted to reforest more than 14,000 acres of national forest land. So, remember, the flood allegedly killed every tree on Earth by covering it in water for over a year. Noah wouldn't have had any seeds, or any cuttings, rather, since it's trees, to grow those trees from, and all the other plants on the face of the Earth. Just throwing it out there.
Now, one region called Pumice Plain was buried under 6 feet of sterile rock and volcanic ash and dust called pumice. Now, scientists assumed that nothing could grow or live in such nutrient-poor soil, so they assumed that recovery should take a really, really long time.
Oddly enough, according to the same website, the area in question has been recovering considerably slower, and as David is going to explain in just a minute, the recovery is being done in part because of a plant that has a symbiotic relationship with a nitrogen-harvesting bacteria, which allows the nitrogen to go back into the soil. The elk come over to eat the stuff, they pull seeds with them, and so on. But yeah, David's going to explain this in a minute for why it's actually happening, but it's actually happening at a much slower rate than everywhere else that didn't get sterilized. Also, one thing David's going to gloss over is that part of the reason the extra seeds are there and growing on top of the lupines is that animals are dragging them there. So presumably when the animals left the ark, they must have also been dragging the seeds with them that Noah never took. And all the plants from the ark miraculously only grow in the zones we see them grow in. The animals that passed over the Grand Canyon, for some reason, didn't bring very many seeds at all with them. But the animals that went much further away to Washington did.
Only it didn't. You see, flowering plants called lupins were soon growing in the soil. Now, unlike most plants, this one lives closely with a bacteria that harvests nitrogen out of the air instead of the soil.
Oddly enough, the Bible doesn't mention how symbiosis helped the plants grow after the flood. The Bible only tells us that God created rainbows as a promise that he'd never flood us again. But I digress.
So these plants could grow in the so-called useless soil, and their nutritious seeds served as food for the humble pocket gopher.
Also, the mighty elk, who poop all over the place and help deposit nutrients into the less than ideal soil. Remember, David didn't call it useless in the first part, but he conflated it in the second part. So David would have us believe that subpar soil is equivalent to sterile, useless soil.
Now, these tiny mammals soon moved in to eat the lupin, and in the process, they started to stir up the soil.
I mean, yeah, that's part of it. He's correct. But also, you know, David, we understand this because scientists went out and studied it, right? You do realize the same scientists you claim thought that the soil was bad were also the same scientists who helped clear out the wood so that it could be repurposed, and so that the land could be freed up to help reforest in the first part. The scientists you claim that thought that could never happen, David. Your own contrary nature even disagrees with you at this point. Your logic is self-defeating.
So soon, new plants and animals could move in. Now, within about a decade, Mount St. Helens was once again a thriving ecosystem.
All thanks to the scientists who helped reforest all the areas around it so that such a thing could happen. And your only contention, your only reason for believing that the flood existed and that this is proof for it, is the fact that it happened a little faster than you think the scientists thought it would happen. Do you understand yet, David, why you really do not understand this?
No ecologist imagined that life could regain the area so quickly after such incredible devastation.
I don't have any idea what source he's citing on how fast some specific ecologist may have thought that it was going to happen. But David also isn't making any arguments for why it's all coming from areas where the vegetation all exists and not spontaneously just happening somewhere in the middle, like on the side of the volcano, maybe a mile or 2 or 5 from any other nearby vegetation, for example. The reforestation is happening from the places where the forest already exists to the places beside where the forest exists, and also where we're replanting those millions of trees over the past 4 or 5 decades.
But it did.
Praise the tree planters.
And now, only years later after the initial eruption,
and 10 million trees and 4 decades, and plenty of wildlife to help spread the seeds, and favorable conditions for the seeds to grow in.
well, you'd never imagine that this place was desolate just a few decades ago.
Well, I would actually, because I went to public school, and they talked about it, and I understand how volcanoes work, and I understand how ecology works, at least on a basic level. So actually, I could imagine such a thing, and I pretty easily do imagine such a thing.
It seems that God has specifically designed life to be able to regain its footing.
So you've told us about symbiotic evolution. You've told us how plants spread out over time. You've told us how animals help spread those plants out. You've shown us, in fact, how that is the specific mechanism for how the plants got spread out so rapidly. Not to mention all the assistance we've given the forest in being reforested. You haven't actually shown us any plausible mechanism for spontaneous growth of already existing plants in areas where those plants don't already exist or are not transported to. And you're still convinced, despite all of this evidence that you've just shown us in your own video, by your own admission, in your own words, that somehow your God still made it happen spontaneously, even though every piece of evidence you've shown us indicates exactly the opposite, even by your own admission. You are a charlatan.
Even after a catastrophe.
Except it's after a catastrophe completely unlike that of the flood. That's almost like saying, wow, arsonists exist, Therefore, I guess God is a firefighter.
Now you see, after the flood, plants and animals would have quickly recolonized, and they would have turned the landscape into a beautiful and livable world.
Except Noah never took any plants on the ark with him at all, and he actually sent a dove out to look for an olive branch, which had apparently never stopped growing, even though it was covered with water allegedly, for over a year. But somehow, every plant on Earth came from whatever was left of that one olive branch, and somehow the animals didn't eat all of the plants to extinction on their way. Because as we just talked about, the elks and other animals only started moving into those areas as the plants slowly started to spread back into them first. And that was only still after we humans found 10 million trees to plant there in the first place in order to help it along. But okay.
And this wouldn't have taken many decades. Mount St. Helens powerfully illustrated just how quickly an ecosystem can recover.
But only if you have enough humans to plant 10 million trees and also have a government in place to prevent anyone from using it as farmland.
I'm David Rives. Truly, the heavens declare the glory of God.
No, David, you proclaim the glory of your alleged God, because the heavens themselves are silent, and that's why you have to make these videos where you try to prove one thing, but then present evidence only for the thing you're not trying to prove. Anyway, that's going to be it for today. If you enjoyed this, click that thumbs up. Be sure to leave a comment down below, share the video, etc., etc. And as always, this has been Reverend JR signing off.